most of us come here to say, hey, we just got a new $1 million client, or we just landed a $10 million investment. But none of us ever come here to say running a business is really hard and it's lonely and I need help and this sucks, right?
Hello, everybody. This is Gary Smith with Nectar Bridge. This is the Nectar Bridge podcast. My guest today is Matt Sloane. He's a Huntsville newly found native. He attended Emory University and was a medical producer at CNN for over 13 years and developed an interest in drone technology over a decade ago with the Atlanta Drone Group. This turned into Skyfire AI. We'll talk about that in a moment. They're a provider of drone solutions for public safety applications, including drone first responder, disaster response, medical delivery, and more. He's also joined by his cat, I see there, if you can see video. He also co-hosted, along with Krista Moulton, the podcast Emotional Runway, Mental Health for Entrepreneurs. So where we met is he spoke at the Propel conference recently in Huntsville, and I asked him to come on and talk about all of these things. I especially wanted to talk about the emotional runway and how it relates to entrepreneurship, but I wanted to start with how Matt got into the drone business. Matt, where do you want to start? CNN? Drone technology? Where?
Yeah, let's start with CNN. That works. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of an unusual career path. But, when I, as you said, I went to Emory, and when I was a freshman in college at Emory in Atlanta, was right in during the 2000 election. And so, we didn't have a president for, several weeks after that election. And my roommates and I said, hey, why don't we go down to CNN Center? Something cool's got to be going on down there, given this historic news. And so we did. And we went, there was a show there called Talk Back Live. I don't know if you remember that show, but it was actually took place in the atrium of CNN Center, which was like open to the public. And so this guy walked up to us and said, hey, you guys want tickets? And we're like, yeah, sounds great. So, we sat down in the audience and listened to the show. And then after the show was over, I went up to the host and just said, hey, how do I get an internship here? And she said, talk to that lady. And I went and talked to that lady, and she said, send me your resume. And I said, I've been in college for like a month. I don't really have a resume. So let me write one and get back to you. So I did. And about 14 years later, I was working there. So, for the next 14 years. And so, it was a fantastic career. Really had a lot of fun, got to travel the world and do really interesting things and meet all kinds of interesting, famous people and not so famous people that were just fascinating. And one of the projects that I was working on, in my sort of last couple of years there was a program called Fit Nation. And it was basically like a precursor to The Biggest Loser, where, we would take people who were wanting to get their lives together and get in shape and quit smoking and all these other things. And we put them through 8 months of triathlon training. And then at the end, they did a triathlon together. And so I was actually looking for a way to shoot video of them swimming and out in the ocean. And so I bought a drone, and they had just come out. I bought it at Brookstone, it was like a toy. I kind of played around with it for a little bit. And then I knew I had decided I wanted to start my own business, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And so I decided to leave CNN. I was able to take that project with me as a, kind of a freelance project while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. And was asked to go speak to a group of public safety, public information officer trainees about how CNN covered major news stories. And I said, I've got this drone now, so we can fly over these scenes. And 4 fire chiefs came up to me after that and said, hey, I want to get that for my department. How do I do that? And I said, I have no idea, but this is what I'm going to do. So that was my light bulb moment, and ended up starting Skyfire, its predecessor form, the next day. And we just kind of made it up until we knew what we were talking about and went out there and did it.
I got to jump in and ask, because I didn't catch this in the keynote. You bought your first drone at Brookstone.
Yeah.
I'm visualizing you going into a mall at, around Peachtree or Buckhead or someplace, and, going into the store in the mall. I may have the wrong mental picture here, but is that about how it went down?
No, that's exactly how it went down. Yeah. No, you got it right. And in fact, it's kind of funny because at the time, CNN drones were so new in the commercial space. I mean, obviously,
Right.
they've been, in the military space for a long time, but I just said, like, I asked my boss, and my boss was like, I mean, yeah, sure, I guess. Well, we didn't realize that at the time, CNN legal department had really started thinking about, hey, like, we don't want to be on the wrong side of this thing. The FAA eventually is going to put some
Mm-hmm.
rules in place. So, let's make sure that we do this smartly. And they were absolutely right about that. So I actually got in trouble for buying it, and ended up becoming part of the group that started to talk about these issues and figure out, how drones could be used for CNN. They use them quite effectively today. But yeah, it's funny because that's how it all started. And you're absolutely right. It was in Lenox Mall. I went into Brookstone and bought a drone on my corporate card and got in trouble for it. So
My brother owns a drone. He's into photography. He just owns a hobbyist kind of drone. He flew over some timber property that we have in Crenshaw County, which tragically is not in the path of a Costco or anything. But he took some video using that drone, and I actually remember him mentioning, um, we can look at this footage, but like if we start listing the property or something, we have to be really careful about whether or not or how we use this footage in any commercial context whatsoever.
yeah.
So that was my mini education on all that.
Yeah, well, and it's yeah. So the rules are, if you're using it for commercial purposes, you have to go get the certification. If you're doing
Right,
it just for fun, you don't. Well,
right.
actually, now there's a certification for that too, but it's significantly less burdensome. So, yeah, at the time there was none of that. So it was a free for all. Everybody was doing kind of whatever. And the FAA, was like, yeah, we better put a handle on this before it gets out of hand, because people were, buying them by the millions, for Christmas, and going out and doing dumb stuff. So yeah, the FAA has come a long way on that on that front.
I think every technology starts out with that kind of Wild West, low regulation, and then the consequences hit, and then now we have to get licenses.
Yeah, well, and if you think about it too, I mean, it's like if somebody gave you a remote control car here in Huntsville and you went and took it out on the highway.
Yeah,
That's exactly what you're doing. Is you're putting a
exactly.
toy drone up in the national airspace, and if you're
Yeah,
out flying over a timber property, in the country, you're probably okay. If you're out flying here next to Redstone Arsenal, that could be very dangerous. So,
yes,
having some framework for that, I think, is really important.
totally makes sense. Um, wanted to first, let's just talk about the Emotional Runway podcast. What got you inspired to do that with Krista, and what did that effort look like?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had been running the business for 6, 7 years at that point. We were on our way to, we were growing significantly, and I
Mm-hmm.
was pretty excited about that. And then COVID hit, and what
Mm-hmm.
we were doing at the time was a lot of in-person training, and so obviously that took quite a bit of a hit there. And so the debt was piling up, and there were all these government loan programs and things like that for during COVID, and we took advantage of all of them. But then started to realize, like, well, wait a minute, then what happens, right? Like, the business is still not going to recover for a couple of years. And ironically, it wasn't 2020 where we saw the biggest impact. It was like 21, and then dragging into 22, where the economy still hadn't come back yet. The loan programs were gone. And so I started to realize, like, wait a minute, my name is on all of this debt, and
Yeah.
I was unhappy and I was really struggling. And, I think what I realized was I need some help. And I went looking for it and I couldn't find it. I couldn't find anything that was, focused specifically on entrepreneurs. Like, obviously I could have, found a therapist and all that. And I did do all that, but, therapists don't understand, like, the entrepreneurship world like an entrepreneur does. Many therapists are business owners themselves, but they're very limited, right? They have a couple of clients in a small office and the overhead is low. And so, it was hard to, like, get somebody who really could relate. And so I said, look, I don't know. I went to LinkedIn and I made a post on LinkedIn, and I said something to the effect of, I most of us come here to say, hey, we just got a new $1 million client, or we just landed a $10 million investment. But none of us ever come here to say running a business is really hard and it's lonely and I need help and this sucks, right? Because we don't want our investors to see that. We don't want our clients to see that. And so, it's a shame thing. And so I just said, I'm going to change that. I don't know what that's going to mean. I'm just putting it out there into the universe. And to his credit, Rigved Joshi, who runs the I2C incubator here in town, commented on it, and he said, "Hey, we got a building full of entrepreneurs. Why don't we figure it out together?" And so, there's still some projects that we want to do together. The first one that we jumped in on was that podcast, and he had been talking to Krista about another project, and the two of us just got together and started something. I think probably 12 people have listened to the podcast, and I would love to get back to it and really put some effort behind it. My life looks a lot different now than it did back then, and I actually have some time to work on it now. So it is something I want to get back to, but it was as much therapy and catharsis for me as it was helping other people. And it's funny now, like every now and then somebody will find it and say, "Hey, this was really inspirational." Obviously I brought it up in that speech. And so a couple people have, that were there went and listened to it and said, "Hey, this is really inspirational." So, look, the content still holds and I want to do more of it. And so, it's a passion project of mine. Certainly. It was an absolute necessity back then. Now it's a passion project.
Yeah, and I'll put the link to that podcast series in the show notes so that I think it is a great resource for people to listen to. I've already listened to, I'll just say, about 1.5 episodes. You were nice enough to come on fairly soon after I asked you, so I've not had a chance to do the Terry Gross level of research that I should have. But the things that I've heard are very valuable, and I'll throw in an idea from a third party source, but I think it keys to what you talk about in that podcast and what you talked about in that keynote. The founder of BNI, Ivan Meisner, I heard him recently say in another podcast that we're always comparing our insides with other people's outsides. And to go to something you said about LinkedIn is like Facebook for business. And for the most part, what gets traction on LinkedIn, what certainly our stakeholders seem to want us to do, is to be just extremely positive. We talk about our wins. We talk about the new customers we land. We don't talk about the customer we lost. We talk about our successes. We don't talk about when things blow up on the launch pad. And, we talk about perhaps our great vacation that we took. We don't talk about how we took a bunch of phone calls while we were on that vacation, or that we're having trouble unwinding, even, whether things are going well or not. So talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, like you said, I mean, it's a curated feed, right? Like we only put on those things. I mean, all of us do it, right? When we go on Facebook, we post the happy family photos, and we don't post the like, "Oh, my wife and I are ready to, to kill each other." Why you'd never do that, right? I mean, that so. Right. But what that leads to, and what I think people forget when they read those things, is, oh, that's the whole story, right? Or
right.
Oh, they posted this picture where everybody's smiling and holding hands. That means everybody's getting along great. No, that's just a picture. That's a moment in time, and in some cases, it's a faked or curated moment in time to make everybody think that everything's okay. And look, it's human nature, right? But I also think it's important to remember that that's not always reality. In fact, most cases it isn't reality. And it's the same thing on LinkedIn, right? And so, there's good days and there's bad days. And look, we, at the time that I made that, finances were the big struggle that we were having. You can be fully, well funded with millions of dollars in the bank and doing great and still have the same issue. It's not really about the money as much as it is that, like, okay, hey, here's $20 million, or you just got this big contract, and you've got to figure out how to service that contract, and there's going to be money in the bank to do it, but that also means you got to hire people, and you got to keep track of everybody and build processes and all that. And so that's all hard, right? It's not easy. And I think as entrepreneurs, we don't give ourselves enough credit. I think I mentioned this in the speech, but I heard on Shark Tank one time, entrepreneurs are the only group of people that'll work 100 hours a week, so they don't have to work 40 hours a week. And and it's true. And there's an emotional toll that you get from working 100 hours a week, and that's not an exaggeration in some cases. And I think it's really important to keep track of that stuff. And so that's where the name came from, Emotional Runway. We always talk so much about fiscal runway. How much fiscal runway do I have left? How many months do I have until I either have to get a new investor or raise some more money or whatever? But like I said, the emotional runway, like, do I have the stamina to to carry this through. And if you don't, the answer is find somebody who can help you, go to your investors and say, hey, like I need to hire a person that can manage XYZ process or whatever whatever that looks like for you. But you can't do it all. Although we have this diluted sense of grandeur as entrepreneurs that like we know everything, we can do everything. Like it's funny because I recently had this conversation with somebody. I got into the drone industry to be in the drone industry and to
Right.
help first responders get drones. I didn't get into the drone industry to run a company and fundraise and figure out HR and finance and all that kind of stuff. I never knew anything about that stuff and I never wanted to. But if your company is successful in any way, you're going to need to start thinking about those things. And so, I got to a place where I was, and I love this distinction, I was working on the business and not in the business. And that's a
Hmm.
very different thing.
Yes, for sure. I think in every episode of my podcast, I say not to sound infomercially, but that is actually a segue to say that's what I try to help people with, and it is like one of the number one diseases of any like small business, new business, startup is founders are usually visionaries. So you're more of a visionary type. You had an idea, you wanted to run with it, and as you say, everything else was like secondary, not necessarily. It either wasn't in your skill set or just was secondary interest and just kind of in your way. And that's a real problem. And I guess to kind of cap off the infomercial, people like me can help, but frankly, we can't take it all off the owner's shoulders because it's still their baby. We can help with the task. We can't take away all the responsibility. So that's certainly a big issue. I wanted to talk about not like your business is a venture capital funded business. You're doing innovative things. I wanted to also talk a little bit about small businesses, which are just vanilla bread and butter businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Guy with a plumbing company, somebody wanted to start a civil engineering firm. And I think two key differences are you're typically not going to attract money because of the novelty of the idea. You may find funding sources, but you're going to have to kind of find them a different way. And I think the other thing is if you come out and do something like spectacular and new, and I cannot speak from experience, I've never been in a venture capital entrepreneurial effort of my own. But if you do something that in 2014 is kind of cutting edge with drones, I guess there's some comfort in that if it fails, it was an untested idea, so it was possible to fail or succeed. Whereas if you start a law firm and you fail, you just feel like you failed at doing something that thousands of people have succeeded at. So there's
Yeah.
different emotional pressures. And again, all I can do is give anecdotes here. I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think a lot of the same problems are still there, right? Like,
Yeah.
yes, I think it was in some ways, a much harder path to do what we did because there wasn't a market. We had to create a
Yeah.
market and we had to wait a long time and do a lot of education to create the market. So that was our big challenge, right? But there's lots of other big challenges that are involved in the business and customer acquisition, or in this case, really making a market from scratch. We have really close friends that run essentially a clinic.
Okay.
Without giving a lot of specifics,
Yeah.
it's a medical type clinic, and they have a waiting list with 200 people on it. So customer acquisition is never going to be their problem. But they
Right.
still also have to run the back office and they have to deal with insurance companies and they still have to deal with, employees coming and going and people quitting at, not showing up and hiring and firing and all that stuff. And so all of that's hard, right? Like
Yeah.
my big thing, one challenge that I have that those types of businesses don't have is that I also have to be responsible to my investors. Okay, well,
Right.
you might not have that challenge, but you still have all the other ones, right? So I don't think there's as much of a difference as you might think. To your point about though, like there's starting a law firm is not anything novel. But you still have to go find clients places, and you
Yes.
still have to protect your reputation, and you still have to figure out billing, and you still have to pay taxes, and you still have to do all the things. And there's a lot of regulatory stuff that goes along with it too, and it depends what subsection of the law you're dealing with. And I mean, if you think about, like, there is no safe route, right? Like,
Correct.
it used to be that you could go get a government job and that was a safe route. And then, the government was just shut down for what, 45 days, and all these people,
Yeah.
were not getting paid. And then, or, hey, I'm a bureaucrat in the government, I'm perfectly safe. And then Doge comes in and says, no more bureaucrats, So, like, there is no go get a job at IBM, work there for 40 years and get a pension and retire happily at 65. That's just the fantasy at this point. And so, what does that look like? I think, we've become much more of a gig economy. And, look, you can make just as much money if you're really dedicated to it. You can make just as much money driving Uber as you can, any other thing, right? You just have to do it a lot.
Mm.
And you can, I have a very good friend that I grew up with, and my dad was a doctor, her dad was a plumber, and they lived in a nicer house than we did because he made a very successful plumbing business. So I think it's easy to do the, like, moral equivalency game, but I don't think it's fair, because I do think that these are the same challenges no matter what you're doing. You might be a doctor, maybe you're getting paid $500,000 a year, but your malpractice, I can tell you from my own experience. My dad was an OBGYN, he's retired now, but he was paying $180,000 a year in malpractice or something.
Oh
So his
yeah.
salary might have been high, but when he was running his practice, his expenses were also through the roof. So I don't think I don't think it's that different. It's just maybe a slightly different set of problems.
I am in total agreement. Lest that be misunderstood, starting a law firm is not easy. It's just more like the idea of it is more proven. But as you
Yeah.
say, um, well, first of all, I'll totally agree with you that customer acquisition is almost always difficult, especially at first. And that's probably one of those leading areas where comparing yourselves to others and how easy it looks when you see other people do it because they're not sharing their frustrations. I hear so many people say, "Oh, I just built my business through word of mouth."
Yeah.
And okay, well, that's probably true to some extent, but there were there were a lot of sacrifices made to get to the point where that flywheel started turning, and you know you did a lot of networking, and
Yeah.
you engaged in a lot of activity to get to that point where it all feels like word of mouth.
Yeah.
Um, so I said in the intro that you were a relative newcomer to Huntsville, and I'm not sure that's exactly accurate. How long have you lived in Huntsville?
So actually, next week it'll be 5 years, which is crazy to me.
5 years.
It feels like 5 minutes, but yeah, it's been 5 years.
I understand. That's about the length of time we've lived here as well. So we both got here during COVID times,
Yep.
more or less, and that was definitely a different experience. Um, is there anything I haven't covered that you wanted to talk about or bring out?
I think the one thing that I would share is that I think, like you just talked about it a little bit too, but networking is really the most critical thing. And I think a lot of us don't love doing it.
Yeah,
I happen to be like a massive extrovert, and maybe that's what drew me to journalism and going out and talking to
yeah,
people. So it doesn't bother me, but I know that it does with a lot of people. And I think that it's a lot of repetition. It's a lot of cycles. It's a lot of networking events. And like you said, that word of mouth doesn't happen overnight, right? It's because of
right.
all the networking, and then, making a good reputation. The word of mouth might start without a good reputation, but it certainly doesn't continue unless you cultivate that. And so, to the extent that, you can make sure that everybody that comes through your doors is getting, the best service, the best attention, not to the extent that you're killing yourself trying to do it, but I think it's really important. And it's one of the things that we've talked about as a company too, is, one of the reasons that our company has such a great reputation is because we treat everybody the same, and everybody gets individualized attention, whether you're a tiny police department or a huge federal agency. We will always take your phone call. We will always answer. And that's something that we've worked really, really hard to maintain as we got bigger. That's resource intensive. And, there is something to be said for that too. So I think that's really important. And then, the other thing is take advantage of the resources that are in this area. I mean, certainly Huntsville's growing by leaps and bounds every day. That was the first Propel Symposium. It certainly won't be the last. And so,
Yeah.
if what's the old adage? Hire your weaknesses. So,
Yeah.
if you start getting into it and you go like, oh, I actually don't have any idea how to do business taxes. Well, hire somebody.
Yeah.
Or hey, I don't really know how to do marketing. You don't have to go hire a marketing agency right away, but there's plenty of people, especially like I said, in the gig economy now.
Yeah.
Jump in and just say, hey, can you help me? Use the resources like I2C that we have here in town. Which if you're not familiar with, it's the incubator entrepreneur space at UAH. They have a lot of great resources, and by joining, you get an office. If you need it, you get access to marketing services and some financial services, and some, if you're developing software, you get some AWS credits and things like that. And so just find people like that. Go talk to, the Small Business Development Center. If you're not familiar,
Hmm.
they'll help you for free with a bunch of these things. So there's lots of great resources. Make use of them. Go talk to the chamber. They're incredible.
Yeah.
You're not alone. You don't have to do it alone. And like I said, this is an area that I'm trying to do more leadership around, and make resources available to people, because it's lonely at the top, and it's your idea that you created. It's in some ways, your whole thing is on the line here. So it's easy to feel like you're by yourself, but you're not.
Great. Yeah, I need to check in with I2C. I have made use of the SBDC. I am, for reasons that are convoluted to explain, I'm kind of attached to the Opelika office, because those are the people that I first met with when I was in Montgomery, and apparently we're like bonded for life. But the people at kind of tied to UAH are great. UAH is a fantastic school. My son went there, and all those resources that you mentioned are great. I'll put those in the show notes. I'll come back to one thing you said about networking. You mentioned being extroverted. I feel like I'm reasonably extroverted as well. My pain threshold is networking, easy, enjoyable. Cold calling,
Yeah.
as in, and you've described elsewhere, talking going to venture capital people, going to sources of funding and having to do pitches, and a lot of that feels very much like cold calling to me. Cold calling, very much outside of my comfort zone, but I am so comfortable with just going into a room full of people and talking to them, that I find it difficult to relate to how difficult it is. But I have read, more introverted, and often that's correlated with more technically minded folks who just say, oh, going into a room full of people I don't know, that is just like nails on a chalkboard. I just
Yeah.
can't stand it. That may be an area you talked about, outsourcing your weaknesses. That may be an area where you have to find somebody who is technical enough to understand what you're trying to do, but more extroverted, who is willing to go, be in those rooms, because it can be painful. I will
Yeah,
admit.
but yeah, get bring on a co-founder.
Yeah.
Find somebody who believes in your idea, that's willing to do a little bit of networking for you. There's a lot of online places now too, so you don't have to go into that room physically. So all these
Yeah.
groups and stuff online. The what's happening in Huntsville. I mean, depending on the type of business, obviously, that you run.
Right.
There's lots of ways to not have to go walk into a room cold. The other
Yes.
thing is too, like, take advantage of other people in the community that have done it and let them make intros for you. So then it's not
Yes.
really a cold intro; it's a warm intro.
Absolutely.
I'm doing a friend of mine runs a picture framing shop here in town at Low Mill, and I said, "Oh, I know like 5 people who just got offices who probably need framing done. So let me just make an introduction, and then that way you don't have to go in cold." So I think one of the things that you can do is leverage folks like you and I who know lots of people in town and say, hey, who do you know that might need this service? And then it's more of a direct intro rather than you're walking into that room with 100 people trying to figure out who to talk to next, because it's daunting even for extroverts like us.
Yeah.
So.
Well, just to illustrate small world syndrome, you must be talking about Ryan at Low Mill.
I am, exactly, yes.
And I've done business with him as well. I met him initially at a chamber business and breakfast event, which is it's like speed dating for business. You get in there and you just swap business cards, and everybody gets a minute to introduce themselves.
Nice. So
that's kind of like networking on hard mode a little bit, but it is you meet a lot of great people. Well, Matt, I appreciate your time today. I didn't mention it going in, but we're recording on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, so I appreciate you taking time out of the holiday week to come talk with me, and look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.